June 19, 1944. 0800 hours. Philippine Sea, 120 miles northwest of Guam. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pacific waters as Lieutenant Commander Jisaburo Ozawa peered through the canopy of his Mitsubishi A6M50. The sea below shimmered like polished steel, reflecting the formations of Japanese aircraft streaming toward the American carrier fleet. The humid tropical air carried the acrid scent of aviation fuel and the metallic taste of anticipation that every combat pilot knew intimately. Ozawa's hands, calloused from countless hours gripping the Zero's control stick, adjusted his silk flight scarf, a small ritual that had kept him alive through 37 previous combat missions. Behind him, stretched across 15 miles of ocean, flew the largest Japanese naval aviation strike force assembled since Pearl Harbor. 430 aircraft, Zeros, Judys, Jills, and Vals, their engines harmonizing in a symphony of mechanical thunder that seemed to make the very sky vibrate. The rising sun emblems on their wings caught the early light, like droplets of blood against the azure canvas of the Pacific morning. For these pilots, many barely out of their teens, this was their moment to reclaim the glory that had once belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. The radio crackled to life in Ozawa's headset, transmitting the confident voice of his squadron leader. "Remember, when we encounter the new American fighters, do not be deceived by their bulk. They are slow, heavy cattle compared to our nimble Zeros. The Americans have traded our elegant philosophy of speed and maneuverability for brute force and armor. Their new Hellcat is nothing more than a flying truck, powerful perhaps, but clumsy and predictable." Ozawa nodded to himself. His one remaining eye, the left, had been lost to American gunfire over Guadalcanal, focused on the horizon where intelligence reports indicated the American fleet waited. Like every Japanese pilot in that formation, he had been briefed on the enemy's latest fighter, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The reports painted it as a typical American aircraft, over-engineered, overweight, and overconfident. At 9,238 pounds when loaded for combat, the Hellcat was nearly twice the weight of his Zero's 5,000. For 2.5 years, from Pearl Harbor through the dark days of 1942, the Zero had been the undisputed master of Pacific skies. Its 1,130 horsepower Nakajima NK-1F Sakai 21 radial engine could propel the graceful fighter to 351 miles per hour, while its phenomenal range of 1,160 miles allowed it to appear seemingly anywhere across the vast Pacific theater. More importantly, its razor-sharp maneuverability had become legendary. Capable of outturning any Allied fighter, the Zero had transformed aerial combat from a test of mechanical superiority into a deadly dance where Japanese Bushido philosophy met Western industrial might. The early victories had been intoxicating. At Pearl Harbor, Zeros had swept American opposition from the skies with contemptuous ease. Over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, they had established such complete air superiority that Allied pilots began to speak of the Zero in hushed, almost supernatural terms. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, already Japan's most celebrated ace, with 28 confirmed victories, had written in his combat diary, "Our Zero is not merely a machine. It is the steel embodiment of the samurai spirit. Light as a dragonfly, deadly as a katana, it allows us to strike where the enemy least expects and vanish before he can respond." But by the summer of 1943, as American industrial capacity reached its terrible crescendo, a different philosophy was taking shape in the design studios of Grumman Aircraft Corporation on Long Island. The Americans had studied the Zero, captured examples, analyzed its strengths, and, crucially, identified its fatal weaknesses. Where the Japanese had pursued perfection through minimalism, the Americans would achieve dominance through overwhelming force. The result was the F-6F Hellcat, an aircraft that represented everything the Zero was not. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double that of the Zero. Its 650 caliber machine guns could deliver 4,200 rounds per minute, compared to the Zero's two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. Most significantly, the Hellcat incorporated 212 pounds of armor plating, protecting the pilot, engine. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the mobile fleet, had reportedly laughed upon seeing the images, commenting to his staff, "The Americans have built a flying warehouse. Look at this machine. It is enormous, crude, lacking any sense of aerodynamic grace. Our pilots will dance circles around these lumbering giants." This reaction was not merely professional assessment. It was cultural philosophy made manifest. Japanese aviation doctrine, developed through years of successful combat experience, held that victory belonged to the pilot who could outmaneuver his opponent. Speed, agility, and the spiritual discipline of the aviator were valued above mechanical brute force. The Zero's 6.4 pound per horsepower ratio gave it performance characteristics that seemed to defy physics. It could climb like a rocket, turn like a hummingbird, and dive like a falcon. American fighters, by contrast, relied on what Japanese strategists saw as crude technological overkill. Training bulletins distributed to Japanese squadrons in late 1943 reinforced this confidence. The enemy's new Hellcat fighter represents the ultimate expression of American industrial waste. At nearly 10,000 pounds, it is so heavy that it cannot hope to match our Zero's turning radius or climb rate. American pilots, lacking the spiritual preparation of our aviators, will attempt to use superior firepower and armor to compensate for their tactical inferiority. Do not be deceived by the size of their guns or the thickness of their armor. These are signs of weakness, not strength. Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the Devil of Rabaul, with 87 confirmed victories, captured the prevailing sentiment in a letter to his family. The Americans continue to build aircraft like they build their automobiles, big, heavy, and complicated. They do not understand that in aerial combat, the spirit of the pilot matters more than the weight of his machine. When I encounter these new Hellcats, I expect they will fall from the sky like the overloaded freight planes they resemble. The first large-scale encounter between Zeros and Hellcats occurred during the American assault on the Marshall Islands in January 1944. For Lieutenant Commander Ozawa and his squadron, flying from as Ozawa's formation of 16 Zeros climbed to intercept the incoming American strike, the pilots chattered confidently over their radios. "Remember," called squadron leader Takeo Shibata, "these new American fighters are heavy and slow. Use your superior turning ability to get inside their turning circle. Then strike quickly and disengage. Do not attempt to outrun them in a straight line. Their engines are powerful, even if their aircraft are clumsy." At 14,000 feet, the two forces made contact. What followed shattered 2 years of Japanese tactical doctrine in the span of 20 minutes. The Hellcats did not behave as expected. Instead of attempting to turn fight with the more maneuverable Zeros, they employed tactics that seemed to violate everything the Japanese understood about aerial combat. Using their superior power-to-weight ratio and climb rate, the American pilots climbed above the Japanese formation, then dove down in coordinated attacks, using their speed and firepower to slash through the Zero formations before climbing back to altitude. When Japanese pilots tried to follow them upward, the Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower engines pulled them out of range with contemptuous ease. Ozawa found himself locked in combat with a Hellcat piloted by Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu, already an ace with 12 victories. As Ozawa attempted his traditional turning attack, expecting to spiral inside the American fighter's turning radius, Vrachu simply accelerated away, climbed to higher altitude, then dove back down with crushing speed and devastating firepower. The 650 caliber machine guns of the Hellcat, each firing 750 rounds per minute, created a cone of destruction that no aircraft could survive. The engagement lasted 18 minutes. When it ended, 14 of the 16 Japanese Zeros had been destroyed, while the Americans lost only 2 Hellcats. Ozawa, his aircraft riddled with bullet holes, managed to limp back to base on a smoking engine. But the psychological damage was complete. The mathematical precision of American gunnery, the overwhelming firepower, and, most shocking of all, the complete tactical adaptation that neutralized the Zero's traditional advantages, announced that the age of Japanese air superiority had ended. Where the Zero had been refined through years of incremental improvement, the Hellcat had been designed from the ground up, using hard-won combat experience and captured enemy intelligence. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was a marvel of American engineering, producing reliable power outputs that Japanese engines could not match. The 18-cylinder radial air-cooled power plant delivered 2,000 horsepower at takeoff and maintained 1,600 horsepower at 13,200 feet, giving the Hellcat a top speed of 380 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 37,300 feet. These performance characteristics allowed American pilots to control the altitude and tempo of every engagement. The armament represented another philosophical departure. The Zero's 2 20mm cannons were devastating when they hit, but their slow rate of fire, just 520 rounds per minute per gun, required precise aim and close range to be effective. The Hellcat's 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns fired 4,200 rounds per minute collectively, creating a cone of destruction that made precise aiming almost unnecessary. At 1,000 yards range, the combined firepower could literally tear apart any aircraft in seconds. Most revolutionary of all was the Hellcat's defensive philosophy. The 212 pounds of armor plating protecting vital areas allowed the aircraft to absorb damage that would have destroyed any Japanese fighter. The self-sealing fuel tanks, protected by layers of rubber and fabric, meant that what would have been a fatal fuel fire in a Zero became merely a nuisance for a Hellcat pilot. American aircraft could fight, take damage, and return to fight again, a sustainable approach to warfare that Japanese philosophy had never contemplated. By the summer of 1944, the full weight of American industrial might was making itself felt across the Pacific. The Essex-class aircraft carriers that formed the backbone of Task Force 58 each carried up to 90 aircraft, with Hellcats making up nearly half of each air group. The fast carrier task force could put over 900 fighters in the air simultaneously, more than the entire Japanese naval aviation strength in the Central Pacific. Behind these numbers lay more significantly, American pilot training programs were graduating 1,500 new aviators monthly, each with over 300 hours of flight time before reaching combat units. In contrast, Japanese training programs, decimated by fuel shortages and instructor losses, were producing pilots with as little as 40 hours of flight experience. The mathematical equation was becoming increasingly clear. American pilots were better trained, flew superior aircraft, and could be replaced rapidly when lost. Japanese pilots, no matter how skillful individually, were fighting a losing battle of attrition. Nothing symbolized the transformation of Pacific air power more than the simple K-ration chocolate bar that every American pilot carried in his survival kit. These small brown squares, manufactured by Hershey's specifically for military use, contained 600 calories of quick energy, and were designed to remain edible in tropical heat. To Japanese pilots, accustomed to fighting on rice balls and dried fish, the casual abundance represented by American logistics was almost incomprehensible. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, after being shot down and rescued by Japanese forces, wrote in his diary about examining the contents of a captured Hellcat pilot's survival kit. Inside the American's life vest, I found more food than our pilots receive in a week. Chocolate bars, concentrated meat, vitamin tablets, even cigarettes and matches sealed in waterproof containers. The casual waste of it overwhelmed me. This pilot carried enough supplies to sustain himself for weeks, while our own aviators often fly combat missions having eaten nothing but a handful of rice. The chocolate bar became a recurring symbol of American material superiority that appeared in Japanese pilot accounts throughout 1944. It represented not just nutritional abundance, but the entire industrial ecosystem that supported American forces. While Japanese aircraft were maintained with recycled parts and improvised repairs, American ground crews replaced entire engines as routine maintenance. While Japanese pilots flew aircraft that had been patched and repatched dozens of times, American squadrons received brand-new Hellcats with monotonous regularity. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, and one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds, observed that we are samurai, facing not other warriors but an inexorable machine that produces warfare as efficiently as it produces automobiles. The full horror of Japan's situation became undeniably clear during the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19–20, 1944. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, launched what was intended to be the decisive blow against American naval aviation. The attack force of 430 aircraft represented the largest Japanese strike since Pearl Harbor, and confidence remained high despite earlier setbacks. As the massive formation approached the American fleet, Japanese pilots could see the distinctive silhouettes of Essex-class carriers surrounded by their escorts. The sight should have been reassuring. After all, aircraft carriers were stationary targets, vulnerable to determined attack. What the Japanese pilots could not see were the 450 Hellcats already climbing to intercept them, directed by advanced radar systems that had detected the incoming strike while it was still 150 miles away. The slaughter that followed was so one-sided that American pilots began referring to it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 8 hours of combat, Japanese naval aviation lost 395 aircraft and 445 irreplaceable aircrew. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. The kill ratio, over 13-1 in favor of the Americans, represented not just tactical defeat, but the complete collapse of Japanese air power in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, flying from USS Essex, personally shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single day, including 7 in one mission. His after-action report captured the clinical efficiency of the slaughter. The enemy formations were completely predictable. They attempted to employ pre-war tactics against modern equipment and training. Our Hellcats could climb above them, dive through their formations at will, and disengage whenever we chose. It was less like combat than like target practice. For Lieutenant Commander Ozawa, one of only 35 Japanese pilots to survive the day, the psychological impact was devastating. In his final diary entry, recovered after the war, he wrote, "We have lived to see our empire's power broken against American steel." What the Japanese could not have understood was the extent to which the Hellcat represented the full mobilization of American society for war. The aircraft was not merely a weapon. It was the steel embodiment of American industrial democracy. Every Hellcat contained materials from across the continent: aluminum from Tennessee, steel from Pennsylvania, rubber from synthetic plants in Texas, and electronics from Massachusetts. The complex supply chains that kept the fighters operational stretched from the mines of Minnesota to the oil fields of California. The pilots who flew these aircraft reflected the same democratic mobilization. Unlike the elite Japanese naval aviators, selected from narrow social strata and trained in traditions stretching back centuries, American fighter pilots came from every corner of society. Farm boys from Iowa flew alongside college graduates from New York. Mechanics from Detroit served with teachers from California. This diversity brought tactical innovation that Japanese traditionalism could not match. Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu, who would end the war with 19 victories, had been a truck driver before joining the Navy. His practical approach to aerial combat, treat the Hellcat like a very fast truck with guns, exemplified the American approach. Where Japanese pilots saw aerial combat as a spiritual discipline requiring years of preparation, Americans saw it as a technical problem requiring practical solutions. The maintenance and logistics supporting the Hellcat force were equally revolutionary. American carriers operated machine shops that could fabricate replacement parts at sea. Aviation gasoline, lubricants, ammunition, and spare parts flowed to the fleet through supply chains that spanned the Pacific. Japanese forces, cut off from their home islands by American submarines, were reduced to cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep a few operational. For Japanese aviators who survived encounters with Hellcats, the psychological impact went far beyond tactical defeat. The Bushido philosophy that had sustained Japanese aviation since its inception was based on the belief that spiritual preparation and individual excellence could overcome material disadvantage. The Zero's early victories had seemed to validate this approach. Lightweight, maneuverable aircraft, flown by superbly trained pilots, had consistently American pilots did not need to outfly their opponents. They could outgun them, outclimb them, and simply absorb damage that would destroy any Japanese aircraft. The mathematical precision of American gunnery, guided by sophisticated gun sights and backed by unlimited ammunition, made individual pilot skill almost irrelevant. Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the Devil of Rabaul, experienced this transformation personally during a combat with Hellcats over Leyte in October 1944. Despite his 87 confirmed victories and legendary reputation for aerial marksmanship, he found himself completely outclassed by aircraft that could absorb his cannon fire and respond with devastating barrages of .50 caliber machine gun fire. In his final letter home, Nishizawa wrote, "The Americans have changed the nature of air combat itself. They do not seek to outmaneuver us. They simply overwhelm us with firepower and armor. Our bullets bounce off their aircraft like pebbles against castle walls, while their guns tear through our fighters like paper screens. We train to be artists of aerial combat, but they have made war into an industrial process where individual skill matters less than production capacity." By the end of 1944, the statistical superiority of the Hellcat had become undeniable. F-6F pilots had achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio overall, destroying 5,163 enemy aircraft, while losing only 270 to air-to-air combat. The numbers told a story of industrial warfare triumphant over traditional military excellence. American factories had produced over 12,000 Hellcats, while Japanese aircraft production, hampered by bombing, resource shortages, and worker conscription, had fallen to pre-war levels. More significantly, the human cost of Japan's aerial defeat was becoming irreplaceable. The experienced pilots who had dominated Pacific skies in 1942 were dead, and their replacements lacked both the training time and fuel allocations necessary to develop combat effectiveness. American pilot training programs, by contrast, were producing 1,500 new aviators monthly, each with extensive flight experience and comprehensive combat training. The psychological impact extended beyond military circles. Japanese Captain Minoru Genda, surveying the wreckage of Japanese naval aviation in late 1944, made a final assessment that captured the transformation. We believed that warfare was a test of national spirit, that our Bushido philosophy would triumph over American materialism. We were wrong. The Americans have demonstrated that modern war is not about individual excellence. It is about the capacity to produce, supply, and replace military equipment faster than the enemy can destroy it. Their Hellcat is not superior to our Zero because of any single characteristic. It is superior because it represents the full power of American industrial society focused on a single objective. As the sun set over the Pacific on August 15, 1945, the last Japanese Zero fighters sat silent on their airfields, their engines cold, their fuel tanks empty. The announcement of surrender had ended their brief, brilliant, and ultimately futile reign over Pacific skies. In less than 4 years, naval aviation had transformed from an elegant dance between skilled individuals into a brutal contest of industrial capacity and technological superiority. The Hellcat, which Japanese pilots had once mocked as a flying truck, had become the instrument of their complete defeat. Its 19-to-1 kill ratio represented more than statistical superiority. It embodied the triumph of democratic industrialism over traditional military philosophy. Where the Zero had been crafted like a samurai sword, refined through generations of tradition and spiritual discipline, the Hellcat had been manufactured like an automobile, mass-produced through systematic engineering and continuous improvement. The chocolate bar, that simple symbol of American abundance, remained in the survival kits of thousands of Hellcat pilots as they flew over the surrendering Japanese fleet in Tokyo Bay. It represented not just nutritional security, but the entire philosophy that had made victory possible. The belief that superior logistics, overwhelming production capacity, and systematic technological development could triumph over any opponent, no matter how skilled or dedicated. In the end, the Japanese had been correct about one thing. The Hellcat was indeed different from their Zero. It was heavier, less maneuverable, and less elegant. But it was also more powerful, better armed, more durable, and above all, more abundant. In the calculus of industrial warfare, the last Japanese pilot to surrender his aircraft, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, wrote in his final diary entry, "We flew like samurai, but the Americans fought like industrialists. In the end, their factories defeated our honor, their production lines overcame our training, and their Hellcats swept our Zeros from the sky not through superior skill, but through superior abundance." We learned, too late, that in modern warfare, the side that can produce the most weapons fastest will always triumph, regardless of the courage or skill of individual warriors. The Pacific War had taught the world a lesson that would echo through the remainder of the 20th century. In an age of industrial warfare, victory belonged not to the most skillful or most courageous, but to the most productive. The Hellcat's dominance over the Zero was not just an aviation story. It was the story of modernity itself, of systematic engineering triumphing over traditional craftsmanship, of democratic abundance overwhelming aristocratic excellence. As the great carriers of Task Force 58 sailed toward their home ports, their flight decks crowded with battle-scarred Hellcats, they carried with them the proof that American democracy, when fully mobilized for war, could outproduce, outsupply, and ultimately outfight any opponent on Earth. The weight of that lesson would shape the post-war world for decades to come. But for the pilots who had lived through the transformation from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, it remained forever symbolized by the sight of Hellcats climbing into Pacific skies, their powerful engines drowning out the memory of zero dominance, with the mechanical thunder of democratic victory. The mockery had ended. The reckoning was complete. And in the silence that followed the last combat of the Pacific War, the echo of 2,000 horsepower engines carried a message that would resonate through history. In the modern age, abundance is the ultimate weapon. Production capacity the final arbiter of victory. And the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. The key to triumph in any conflict where democracy faces dictatorship, where industrial society confronts traditional warfare, where the future